This video is sponsored by Audible. Audible allows anyone to listen to their favorite stories while doing other things. Whoa. What are you doing? Don't even think about skipping this ad. Yeah, that's right. I see what you're doing, David. Don't think you can get away with it. As I was saying, using Audible means you can listen to your favorite stories while at the same time doing other tasks like chores or exercise. And new members can get a free 30-day trial by going to the link in the description, audible.com/NintendoBC, or by texting NintendoBC to 500-500. Audible includes a vast selection of audiobooks, podcasts, and originals. People who are signed up for Audible get 1 credit per month, which can then be exchanged for any one of these. That means if you do happen to use the free trial, you'll get 1 full audiobook of your choosing at no cost. Given my love for fantasy worlds such as Zelda, I've decided to listen to A Song of Ice and Fire, the first of many audiobooks in the massively popular Game of Thrones series. Members also get access to Audible's Plus catalog, a growing selection of audiobooks and podcasts you can listen to without having to use your credits. So make sure to check out the link in the description or text NintendoBC to 500-500 for a free 30-day trial. That's audible.com/NINTENDOBC. In chaos theory, the butterfly effect is a sensitive dependence on initial conditions in which a small change in one state of a deterministic, nonlinear system can result in large differences in a later state. It evokes the idea that a small butterfly flapping its wings could, hypothetically, cause a typhoon. Or, to put it in simpler terms, one small and seemingly insignificant action can lead to a much bigger consequence, especially when on the topic of timelines. Due to this, the butterfly effect is often portrayed in films and shows whenever time travel is involved. Most of the time it's done as a means of trying to fix a past mistake or action, and thus, this brings us to today's discussion. In the Legend of Zelda series, time travel has been seen throughout numerous games, many of which show the consequences of said actions, whether it be tied to the main story or used as a gameplay mechanic. In this case, the title we'll be focusing on today is Ocarina of Time, specifically what happens at the end of the game. After the Hero of Time defeats Ganon, Zelda uses the Ocarina to send him back to the past so that he can live out the childhood he lost. A decision which had drastic consequences. But what exactly were those consequences? And what if the hero chose to remain in the present? Hopefully, by the end of this video, we'll have an answer to that exact question. In order to properly understand this what-if scenario, we must first talk about what's by far the biggest change this decision had on the series, the child timeline. And to do so, we must first explain how time travel works in Ocarina of Time. When Link first pulls the Master Sword from its pedestal, we're told that his soul was sealed away within the Chamber of Sages for 7 years. In that sense, there is no time travel here. It's kind of like how in Breath of the Wild, Link was put to sleep in the Shrine of Resurrection for 100 years. However, unlike the Shrine of Resurrection, the Hero of Time also has the power to go back through time by returning the blade to its pedestal. The trick to understanding how time travel works is in that 7 years mentioned. Each time Link travels forward and back, the same amount of time takes place between both points. Technically, time is still flowing on our hypothetical timeline. So let's say that Link pulls the Master Sword out for the first time. His spirit's then sealed away for 7 years, and he wakes up in the new present day. He then does some quests, completes the Forest Temple, and returns to the Temple of Time, all in 3 days. If he then decides to return the sword and subsequently travel back through time, and exactly 7 years pass on the timeline, when he appears in the past, he'd arrive 3 days after he had initially pulled the blade. To put it another way, if someone else were to go with him to the Master Sword chamber and wait for him until he comes back, if he was in the future for, let's say, 5 hours, then that same amount of time would have also passed for the person waiting. According to Sheik, time is like a river, the Master Sword acting as a ship, allowing Link to sail upstream and downstream. If this weren't the case, and Link was sent back to the same point in time whenever he traveled forward or backward, any progression done in the future, such as the completion of a dungeon, would be lost. Sheik describing time as a river also suggests that this timeline is independent, meaning that changing anything from the past alters that specific timeline, and does not create an alternate split in which two realities exist, one with the change and one without change. This is important because the very concept of using the Master Sword to hop between the past and future is not what creates the child timeline split. As a matter of fact, it's due to what happens after Link defeats Ganondorf. Zelda uses the Ocarina of Time to restore his lost childhood, and Link returns the Master Sword to its pedestal, taking him back to a point where the blade hadn't yet been pulled. The credits end with one final scene, of a young Link entering the castle courtyard, where Zelda is shown looking through a window, similar to how the events played out at the start of the game. She then turns around, and thus, their first meeting plays out for the second time. Proof that Link was sent back to a time before the Master Sword was pulled. Now, the details of how this all worked are sort of vague. Obviously, Link had to return the Master Sword to the Temple of Time, and at the time she plays Zelda's Lullaby, adult Link still has the blade. If at that moment she sent him back in time, he'd be returning the sword to the pedestal as a child. So perhaps Link was warped back to the temple, returned the blade, and the powers of Zelda's Lullaby let him travel much farther back to a point before he initially pulled the Master Sword. Though what exactly happened is still up for debate. Shortly after leaving the chamber, the Door of Time is sealed in both the adult and child timelines, cutting off the one means of travel, that being the Master Sword. And it's this part right here, which is what causes the split. Since the Door of Time is closed, Ganondorf has essentially lost his only connection to the Sacred Realm and its Triforce, meaning that he never enters the place, and thus never acquires the Triforce of Power. In the credits, we see that the Hyrule of the future continues to exist, with people celebrating all throughout the kingdom. At this point, Link has already returned the blade to the chamber, and since his actions no longer affect that timeline's future, as well as the fact that in his own past Ganondorf would no longer have the means to rule over Hyrule, a new alternate reality has been born. The child timeline. Therefore, if Link had chosen to stay in the present, all games which occur in the child timeline, Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, Four Swords Adventures, would have never happened because that timeline split was never created in the first place. This is, by far, the most significant change to the Zelda series if this what-if scenario really took place. But just because the events of these titles never happen, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything about them is irrelevant. In fact, both Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess introduce us to two different worlds of the series, one being Termina, a realm parallel to Hyrule, the other place a perpetual twilight that the interlopers were banished to following the Interloper War, later named the Twilight Realm. Let's first talk about the latter, as it's much easier to explain. The Interloper War is an event which happened long before Ocarina of Time, and thus long before the timeline split. Therefore, while it's only seen in the child timeline, theoretically this place still exists in the Fallen and adult timelines. In fact, the whole reason both worlds intersect is due to Ganondorf's failed execution, where he was then banished to the Twilight Realm, giving Zant the power he needed to overthrow the Twilight Monarchy and invade Hyrule. Since Link is never taken back to that child era, no timeline exists where he warns Zelda and the king of Ganondorf's plans, meaning that the execution and banishment to the Twilight Realm never takes place. In the adult timeline, Zant would still have been denied the throne, but this time the Twilight live in peace as he doesn't have the power to dethrone Midna. That's the most plausible explanation. But when it comes to Termina, it gets rather complicated. If Termina is a world parallel to Hyrule, and Link never enters it as he chooses to stay in the adult timeline, you'd think that it meant the realm was ultimately doomed to be destroyed by the moon. But Link isn't the only variable in this mystery. We must first answer the question of why it was doomed in the first place. For those who have not played Majora's Mask, the name is referencing an evil so wicked that it was sealed away by an ancient tribe. This same evil is what causes the moon to fall, and therefore it is the being responsible for the destruction of Termina. Prior to Skull Kid, this mask was in the possession of the Happy Mask salesman, who was robbed of it in the woods by the former. Link chases after Skull Kid following the theft of his horse and the ocarina, taking both of them to the world of Termina. Anju's mother gives us some additional backstory for the Skull Kid. Long ago, he was friends with the four giants. However, once they left to guard the four corners of the land, the Skull Kid got angry and began causing mischief. Eventually, the four giants intervened and threatened him, and it's said that the Skull Kid returned to the heavens. It's unclear what this means, however, the heavens could be referring to Hyrule. Eventually, Skull Kid went back to Termina, met the fairies Tattle and Tail, and later stole Majora's Mask from the salesman. With the mask, Skull Kid began wreaking havoc among the residents of Termina, leading to the eventual falling of the moon. One possibility is that the Skull Kid seen here is related to one of the ones found in Ocarina of Time's Lost Woods. He even mentions a fairy kid that taught him that song in the woods. Following the Four Giants threat in the story, Skull Kid may have traveled back to Hyrule for a short while, possibly around the time of Ocarina of Time, returned to Termina, met the two fairies, left once again and stole Majora's Mask, then either encountered Link shortly after, or went back into Termina, used his magic to spread fear and panic, such as turning Kafei into a child, and then went back to Hyrule for a third time, where he confronts Link. This explanation seems more likely, as by the time Link arrives in Termina, Skull Kid has already caused much mischief and suffering in the land. But how exactly does this relate to our what-if scenario? Well, remember that Skull Kid is not the reason why Termina fell into such a chaotic state. Sure, he may have caused issues prior to obtaining the mask, but in reality they were nothing compared to the pranks done after getting Majora's Mask. It's what gave him the power to send the moon crashing down on Clocktown. So, what if he never got the chance to steal it in the first place? Prior to Majora's Mask, the Happy Mask salesman was located in Hyrule Castle, with his own shop set up. In the child timeline, Link would have warned the king of Ganondorf's scheme, and thus prevented any disaster befalling the residents of Castletown. When the Hero of Time first steps into the adult era, it's revealed that Ganondorf got his hands on the Triforce of Power, with Castletown destroyed, Redeads filling the streets. Sure, these might not be the former residents of the place, but it does make you wonder what happened to them. If, by chance, Ganondorf attacked the people, the Happy Mask salesman could actually be dead. Therefore, he never makes his way through the woods and never gets robbed by Skull Kid. So there is a chance that, similar to the Twilight Realm, Termina would have been fine. Well, that was quite the lengthy explanation. Now it's time to move on to the adult timeline. Wind Waker tells us of a kingdom in which a golden power lay hidden, a power sought out by a man of great evil who was defeated and sealed away by a young boy clothed in green. This tale was passed down through generations until one fateful day, when the evil that had once plagued the kingdom of Hyrule returned. The people believed that the Hero of Time would again come to save them, but the hero did not appear. This is, of course, referring to the events which took place in Ocarina of Time. The reason the Hero of Time never appeared in the events prior to Wind Waker's is because he was no longer in that timeline. Thus, the people were forced to leave the fate of the kingdom in the hands of the gods. Their response was to seal away not only Ganon, but Hyrule itself, with a torrential downpour of rains from the heavens. This brings us to the second most significant change to our scenario. The opening makes it clear that it was the lack of a hero which led to the intervention of the gods and flooding of Hyrule. If the Hero of Time remained in the present day, does that mean that he would have stopped this threat? Well, not necessarily. It's not clear when these events took place, but considering this is a tale passed down through generations, one which soon became legend, by then the Hero of Time may have already been dead. With that said, perhaps if Link were to have stayed in the current timeline, another hero would have rised up to face this threat. According to the King of Red Lions, the Hero of Time was separated from the elements that made him a hero following his departure from Hyrule. But this wasn't just a departure from Hyrule, rather a departure from the adult timeline itself. It's said that the Triforce of Courage then split into 8 shards and was hidden throughout the land. In Wind Waker, the new hero must prove his worth by completing the Trials of the Gods, first being the completion of the Tower of the Gods, second, finding all pieces of the Triforce. So, the reason that no hero could stand up to Ganon may have been related to the splitting of the Triforce. Assuming that the Hero of Time never departed Hyrule, he'd still be holding that timeline's Triforce of Courage. If he then passed away sometime after, that piece may have been passed down to the next Link, and thus the Kingdom of Hyrule wouldn't be without a hero. So let's continue with the assumption that in this new timeline, Hyrule was never flooded. How exactly does this affect the adult split of the Zelda timeline, specifically in regards to the two other games, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks? Since the former is a direct sequel to Wind Waker, both Link and Tetra would have never ended up in the world of the Ocean King, so whatever conflict happens there would remain unsolved. This is because Tetra is revealed to be a descendant of the royal family, her true identity being Zelda. In fact, when you look at the portraits found in Hyrule Castle, many of these faces look familiar. Following the flooding of the kingdom, those related to the royal family fled to the mountaintops as a means of one day restoring Hyrule. Tetra's mother gave her a necklace with a piece of the Triforce, which she was told to keep safe. Without the flooding of Hyrule, Zelda's ancestors would have never become pirates. In fact, assuming that there was a hero to stop the threat, she'd probably still be Princess of the Kingdom. Spirit Tracks, on the other hand, is an interesting one. According to the developers, the game takes place 100 years or so after Phantom Hourglass, and in-game information supports this. Sometime after the events of Phantom Hourglass, Tetra and her crew settle on a new land, re-establishing the Hyrule Monarchy, now referred to as New Hyrule. One of the first characters seen in Spirit Tracks is Nico, the same Nico who accompanied Tetra and her gang of pirates in both Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass. In addition, a descendant of Linebeck is found in New Hyrule's Ocean Realm, the grandson of Linebeck. So, hypothetically speaking, if Hyrule was never flooded, there would be no need to set sail and find new land, therefore Spirit Tracks isn't relevant. Correct? Once again, it's not that black and white. While the kingdom of New Hyrule may have never been established in our hypothetical scenario, it has nothing to do with the legend of the Spirit Tracks, and more importantly, Malladus. In the beginning, the people followed the spirits of good, and all was peaceful. But that era of peace soon came to an end. The evil Demon King rose to power, destroying everything in his path. The spirits of good had no choice but to face him in battle. The war that ensued seemed to last an eternity, and much blood was shed. Finally, the spirits subdued the Demon King, though they could not destroy him. Their powers were greatly depleted. With their remaining power, they buried the Demon King's spirit in the ground. They built shackles to imprison him, and a tower that acted as a lock. These shackles cover the land to this day. With their power drained, the spirits of good returned to the heavens. Suddenly bereft of both demons and spirits, this land was entrusted to us. With this information, the history of Malladus and Spirit Tracks seems to precede the establishment of New Hyrule. Engine even states that she met Tetra when she first arrived, becoming close friends with her. It's safe to assume that, even if Zelda's descendants hadn't taken refuge here, Malladus would have broken free from his seal. Early on, we're told that the seal holding down the Demon King, the Spirit Tracks, have begun to vanish. Zelda does end up being vital to the Chancellor's plans, and he himself is the one responsible for the weakening of the Spirit Tracks, but that doesn't mean that the land would have been safe without the establishment of Hyrule. Chances are Cole would have returned in a different form and still freed Malladus. I do have a whole video going into the possibility of Malladus being related to the Demon Tribe's curse, so I'll have a link to that in the description below. Those aren't the only major differences though. Another has to do with Wind Waker's races. For one, the Zora would have never evolved into the Rito, at least the ones found in Wind Waker. The Koroks would likely still take on the forms of the Kokiri, as I'm sure that they were only transformed because it allowed them to fly across the Great Sea. And while we do see some Goron traders, there is no tribe of them in Wind Waker. Without the flooding, more of them would probably still be around. Now, before I end off, I do want to talk a bit more about the Hero of Time. First of all, if he chose to remain in the present, details such as the statue in Hyrule Castle and the tradition of gifting kids with clothes honoring the Hero of Time may have never happened. This all depends on whether those things were done because the hero was no longer in their timeline or not, since Zelda might have done it just so that the hero would never be forgotten. But these sort of legends are often passed down, regardless of what happens to Link, so it's more speculation than anything. Second is that, while we don't know what the Hero of Time would have done if he were to remain in the adult split, there is one thing which may give us a general idea. Following his return to the child era, Navi leaves the Hero of Time, in which Link searches for her, eventually winding up in Termina. So while he's in a different timeline, it's possible that the same events play out. He may have even ended up in that same forest, and perhaps found Termina. Though aside from that, we don't know much. Long story short, Zelda's decision to send the hero back to his own time was a lot more impactful than you may have thought. By doing so, she essentially doomed two different realities. one without a hero, and a new reality which, just like her own, would eventually be plagued by the same evil seen time and time again. That's of course assuming that Ganondorf did have the Triforce of Power due to the Hero of Time being sent back to the Child Era, which, by the way, I have a much older video going over that theory, so feel free to check that out if it's something that interests you. Despite this being yet another blunder by the royal family, I don't necessarily blame Zelda for her decisions. This whole time, we've looked at the bigger picture of how her choices affect Hyrule itself. But assuming that she didn't send Link back, his life would have probably been more tragic. He'd be living in a world that's only just recovering from evil. Many of the people he knows are either dead or still recovering from past trauma and suffering. Plus, there have been theories on whether the sages are dead or not. Even if that's not true, their awakening as sages would certainly affect his relationship with them. Giving Link the chance to relive his childhood means living in a Hyrule not tainted by evil, one in which Ganondorf never enters the Sacred Realm, one where Castletown remains intact, and where the sages never awaken. This is someone who risked his life to save those in need, and to Zelda, not giving him that happiness he deserves would be a fate far crueler than death. It may have been a mistake, but it was a mistake that any of us could make. After all, we're all human. Well, that was quite the video. Honestly, I could have written much more since there are a lot of smaller things which may or may not have changed as this is a what-if scenario, but for the sake of my own sanity, I chose to leave it at that. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. The last time I did a what-if scenario was way back in my early days, and they're surprisingly really fun to make. I wouldn't mind making more of these if people were interested, the only issue is trying to come up with interesting ones. If you want to see more content like this, I do appreciate if you consider subscribing. And with that, happy holidays! I'm hoping that this video gets done before Christmas, but if by chance it does go live then, I guess Merry Christmas? Anyways, I've been NintendoBlackCrisis, and I'll see you all next time.